it's a UK group, Extinction Rebellion. And I kind of see them in some sense as the forerunners of where we might go if we regard the impending climate catastrophe as a doom and gloom laden existential crisis. It's like, man, half the people on the planet are going to die. No solution is too drastic. Okay, so that's Extinction Rebellion in some sense. So maybe you could tell the story about that.
I was going to say, they say no solution is too drastic unless it's nuclear energy, in which case they're against it. Or in case it's fracking, in which case they're against that too. And I get at that right away, which is that why are the people who are the most apocalyptic the most dead set against the things that have reduced carbon emissions, natural gas and nuclear, by far the two things that have reduced carbon emissions the most. Instead, they're in favor of things that don't work, adding a lot of unreliable renewables onto your grid, making electricity expensive, making societies less resilient to climate change. Those are all high priorities for the apocalyptic environmental movement. So it's not just that.
Why? What's going on? Like,
well, I mean, it was interesting.
So interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were on my mind a bit when I was working, particularly towards the last chapter. I go through three core motivations. One is there's certainly powerful financial interests at work, renewable energy companies. I document how fossil energy companies have financed anti-nuclear campaigns for 50 years. I also have the third, it's the chapter, so chapters 10, 11, 12, the last three chapters of the book look at the motivations. Chapter 11 is more on kind of will to power, a desire for status, for feeling important, particularly places like Europe, which are becoming irrelevant with the rise of China, wanting to assert their power over the developing world. You know, it's no coincidence, I think, that as Europe's power has faded, they've become more demanding to take control of the international economy in the name of climate change. And then the third chapter kind of says, you know, those are both important motivations, but there's something else going on, which is that apocalyptic environmentalism is clearly a religious movement. Everything about it, the guilt, the original sin, the apocalypse, the obsession with food, you know, various things about it are clearly a religion. And I'm hardly the first to make that observation. I document, in fact, there's actually good empirical work documenting that. And so I see the, you know, rising secularization, what Nietzsche called the death of God, and the nihilistic vacuum that would be created in its wake as really the underlying engine for apocalyptic environmentalism. It's a way to give meaning to the world.
So, you know, I'm writing a new book, which is going to be called We Who Wrestle with God. And it obviously we're thinking along the same lines and for some of the same reasons, in that there's this adage in the New Testament that warns people that they should deliver unto God that which is God, and unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. And of course, that on that statement is built the notion that separation of church and state is actually appropriate. But I also think that's true psychologically, and this is part of the problem I have with the new atheist movement, or is that if you don't have a domain that's sacred and rituals and to deal, and some understanding that there are deepest values, and that's the domain of the sacred, whether you like it or not, you obliterate that in the name of rationality, and all that happens is that things that are Caesar's now become contaminated with the religious, and that's really not a good thing. It's seriously not a good thing. So it's interesting to see you close the book with that kind of, you know, with thinking that's along the same sort of line. And so did you see that working in you personally?
Yes.
Okay, how?
Yeah, I mean, when I was apocalyptic about climate change, you mean? Yes, for sure. And I came back to my Christianity in writing Apocalypse Never. But it was also, I also became convinced that by Jonathan Haidt and others that having faith was rational. So, you know, that it's actually psychologically healthy to have a faith. And so I had to get over my own demonization of spirituality or demonization of faith, and that unlocked I couldn't finish Apocalypse Never actually until I had done that.
No, I wouldn't have guessed that again from reading the book, because that isn't obvious, just as the psychological issue wasn't obvious. And that I think that's a really good thing, by the way. That should all be implicit in the book rather than explicit. It makes for a less cluttered book, let's say.
I mean, some of my best allies, Steven Pinker, Michael Shermer, are in the New Atheist movement, and I really regard them as friends. I love them. And Steve also blurbed my new book, San Fransicko. And so San Fransicko, and then I'm doing a third book afterwards. And all three books are basically about the threats to civilization from within, and that they all conclude. San Fransicko looks at the religious, the secular religion of compassion, and how it's gone completely crazy to basically result in greater victimization in the name of rescuing victims. And so I'm definitely I think we're after the same big prey here, which is, the threats to civilization are coming from the most civilized members of society, who are also the most secular members of, or they think they're the most secular members of society, and they're projecting their needs they're constructing new religions.
Yeah, well, there are also, so, with the death of God, and this is Nietzsche through Jung, I suppose, because Jung was a great student of Nietzsche, and as much as Freud, for sure, as much as he was a student of Freud's. And Jung was really trying to solve the problem that Nietzsche posed, and that was his life's work. And I think in many ways he actually managed that, pointing out, first of all, that we cannot create our own values. That's actually not possible. We're not wise enough, smart enough. We don't live long enough. We just don't have that much intellectual, spiritual capacity. We have to depend, at least to some degree, on tradition. And that brings up all sorts of problems. And that guilt you talked about, like that religious guilt. I was watching Guy Ritchie's King Arthur the other day, and when the to-be King Arthur puts his hands on the sword, he has this unbearable vision of his uncle killing his father, the evil uncle. And the evil uncle is a very standard archetypal trope. You see it in The Lion King, for example, with Scar. And the evil uncle is often the tyrannical aspect of the patriarchy, let's say. And, we all exist in relationship to that, because we all exist in relationship to this patriarchal social structure, history, because we're historical creatures. And then we all do have this guilt that overwhelms us about the blood and gore and catastrophe that got us to where we are, our unearned privilege, to take a phrase from the radical leftists. It's part of our existential burden. And the existential psychologists, who were followers mostly of can't remember the philosopher's name momentarily, wrote Being in Time, Heidegger, Heidegger talked about being thrown into the world. So you're arbitrarily put somewhere. Your parents are arbitrary. You're subject to society, and you have these existential concerns that will never go away. And one of them is the terrible, corrupt weight of history. And how are you related to that as an ethical being? And the radical leftists are definitely wrestling with that, but in their depression, let's say, they can only see the negative aspect of the patriarchal figure and not the positive aspect. And that's a real catastrophe because, well, it makes you ungrateful for one thing, which is not a good idea in a modern state. So